Lost Voices of South Asia. Thank you all for joining us today for our first collaborative virtual event. We are honored to be working with University of Virginia and Virginia Commonwealth University's Pakistani Student Association to discuss the important topic today. Anti-blackness can be uncomfortably familiar to many South Asians, whether it's the implicit biases or overt beliefs that have long gone unchecked in families and communities. The conversation needs to be brought up. Anti-blackness in the South Asian community is far from a new topic in the discourse. It's unfortunate the conversation arises again and again, most often when another innocent Black life is lost. However, we must talk about this not just when another life is lost, but every day to make sure we are able to make active change and be effective allies to the Black community. Moving on from there, our first guest is Kiana McQueen, who is a current student at Virginia Commonwealth University. She is majoring in business and entrepreneurship. She is also the serving vice president of Black Excellence at VCU. She joined Black Excellence because of her desire to create opportunities to strengthen the Black culture in her university and foster a united bond between all students. So I'll let her take away the conversation today and explain what anti-Blackness is.
Thank you so much for having me. So I want to first start off by saying a quote from Jane Elliott, which she is a diversity educator. She said, "You cannot change what you do not acknowledge." We often hear the words racism or white privilege, but in today's society around racial justice, anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism gets left behind. What anti-Blackness means, it is the root of most oppression and systematic racism. It's kind of a two-part formation that not only dehumanizes the Black community, but systematically marginalizes Black people, which predetermines the socioeconomic status of Blacks in this country. To revert back to Jane Elliott, she did a study called the Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes exercise. And like I said, she started off as a teacher, so she was a third grade teacher. She took third grade students, she separated them by blue eyes and brown eyes. And she told, on the first day, she told the blue eye students that you're smarter, you're nicer, you're better. While she told the brown eyed students, that, you know, they wasn't smart, you know, they wasn't nice. So she kind of criticized them into thinking that they were less than the blue eye students. On the second day, she switched. So the blue eye students became the one that, you know, was criticized, and the other way around. She mentioned prior to the experiment, students who were sweet and nice became mean-spirited. And so that being said, just based on something as simple as eye color can put you in a certain box, you know, so either you could be told you're better than, you know, this person that looks like this or this person that looks like that. And it goes back to the color of your skin. I have myself have experienced through the corporate working world racism by not only being Black, but also being a young woman. And I've had to stand up for myself plenty of times, just coming to work, trying to do my job, and being picked on for every little thing. And it can really, you know, make you feel like you're less than, because you see your peers who are not your skin color that's getting more than you are. So it's a real thing. We're seeing it right now worldwide with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and it's truly injustice based on the color of your skin. What I feel that could, I mean, granted, you know, I do believe that as we're younger, as we're, you know, kids, we don't really know about, racism. We don't really see color. It's something that is kind of, how can I put it? It's kind of taught, because, when you're in the womb, you don't know anything. You learn, how to talk, how to eat. You learn, all those kind of skills, but, you see everybody as one. So I do think that is something that's taught, from generation to generation. So if I could, find out, or figure out a way to improve this, I would say, one way of being is that I do think that, racism, or just diversity in general, should be taught in the school systems, just like sex education is taught. I think that if we catch the youth while they're young, and to teach them, the importance of being, diverse, and, loving everybody as equal, I think that is really the main thing. And also, I feel that it's kind of hard to know, like, let's say I wanted to help out, but I didn't want to protest. How, like, in what other ways can I be a value add to my community? So kind of having an outlet or app, or online website where, anyone can go to find out, hey, how can I help change this law, or, where to vote. And I especially think within today's society with social media, I feel like, it'll be easy doing. And it's just getting everyone to, be able to hop on the bandwagon, and kind of see this thing through. I mean, racism will always be, unfortunately, a thing. But however, I do feel that if we can kind of, jump on it while you have, like I said, younger kids are coming up, and, with social media, I mean, they're looking at any and everything. So I feel like kind of putting something positive, in the forefront would, definitely improve for generations, going forward. But I do know that it is a very touchy subject for a lot of people. But I've experienced it. I'm not gonna say it's not the best thing, but at the same time, you can't hate, and it doesn't make me any better if I look at a certain color. Oh, because this person, this color treating me this way, that means that everybody is like this particular person, and that is not the case. So, yeah. So, that's all I got. Once again, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Kiana. That was very beautifully said. Up next I'm so excited to introduce our two keynote speakers, Ms. Geeta Patel and Samhita Sanya. Geeta Patel is a professor at the University of Virginia with 3 degrees in science and a doctorate from Columbia University in interdisciplinary South Asian studies in Sanskrit and in Urdu. She has published widely both in academic and popular venues on the collusive conundrums passed by bringing gender, nation, sexuality, finance, science, media, capital, and aesthetics together. And she has even translated lyric and prose from Sanskrit, Urdu, Hindi, and Braj. Alongside her today is Ms. Samhita Sanya, who received her PhD at Rice University and went on to join the American University of Beirut as an assistant professor of visual culture, which has allowed her to further probe post-war circulation histories of Hindi film songs across and beyond the Middle East, which have followed by a residence at Yale University and a Mellon Humanities Fellowship. She's currently teaching at UVA, and both of them will be facilitating a discussion on the intersection of race, media, politics, and representation in South Asia. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you for having us. We thought about it as a conversation rather than a keynote. So, we thought it would be more productive to have a conversation between us rather than just talking at you. So it would be livelier, we hoped, but at the same time begin to model how all of us may engage with each other at this enormously fraught time. So, should I just sort of lay out? We thought we'd talk about personal lives and our relationship to work on racism, work on colorism, sort of integrate that into history. Histories that are forgotten, histories that we need to address, and then also talk a little bit about the history of colorism in Bollywood. But I wanted to sort of, so Samantha, how did you encounter both racism and colorism in your life?
I think that my story is like such a cliche almost. I mean, I grew up in Houston, Texas, and growing up, maybe some of you have shared this experience. Like I always thought that like ideas of beauty, like dolls that I would play with, they would always be kind of blonde and blue-eyed. And so this classic way in which even as a child, you sort of internalize whether it's advertising or somehow, even though my parents never spoke like this, just being in a South Asian community, I knew that or had naturalized that being lighter skinned is a better thing. So it's like when I would draw myself, it would always be in a particular way. And I don't think I questioned it for a long time. Like it was taken for granted so much. And the first time I actually consciously thought of this was in a class in college. It was a class on Africana literature and hip hop culture. And the professor went into great detail and sort of like allowed a language for all of us to think about how not only are some of us negatively impacted by these hierarchies that in the end don't make any sense, but also that we can be complicit in them as well. Like even taking things for granted, like maybe many of you know, well, actually we'll get to the film part, but yeah, so I think a lot of that was coming into an awareness and then, going through a phase where I also naively didn't realize that sometimes like without confronting how South Asians are implicated in other privileges, we can perpetuate a certain anti-blackness as well, which is something we'll also get to in this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
What about you, Geeta?
Well, I had a very different upbringing because I grew up in Bombay, and I had a Punjabi mother. So many of you are Punjabi or have grown up there, and with an extremely fair family, and I was born dark. So I paid for colorism from the moment I entered the world. But ironically, it also gave me a huge amount of freedom as a kid. My darkness actually rendered me ugly. People would just say, you're dark and you're ugly. I was asked to stay away from the sun. I was also an obstinate child, so I ended up as a runner and spent as much time in the sun as I could and got darker and darker. So, I mean, it's kind of interesting because I realized very quickly that because I was dark and because of the value given to pale skin, I was completely ejected from the system of value in some ways, right? I had no place in it. So it gave me the freedom to be an intellectual, to read and think and imagine a possibility of release from the expectations of value that were coded into skin. So, it was interesting. Really, I mean, you and I have talked about it. Like it's, the paradox of really being devalued because of your color, and the really bizarre paradox of being released to be a different kind of person because you didn't fit any convention of beauty whatsoever. So, I think, and my stuff on race, it's really, I think it's interesting also in India that I realized very quickly, as a kid actually, that skin became a kind of metaphor through which value was apportioned. Like you know about this sort of, like if people were, they literally had value taken from them, that they were described in relation to their skin. So whether they were Dalit or rural, or Southern, Bahujan, the politics of regionality and the institutionalization of discrimination was often coded in the color of skin in South Asia. So I grew up with it and was really aware of it when I came here, I think. I mean, there's lots more in that, but so what happened when you first began to see, you know, sort of in class, what you were, what, you know, was embedded in a kind of, in racialization and colorization?
I mean, I think it was very empowering, especially, as a college student. And, I was probably much more naive than most of you who are participating in this conversation. I won't say that I was particularly an activist. And I think that, the one thing that it allowed me to sort of really consciously break through was that, oh my gosh, like, how dumb is this? Like, why does our culture have like industries of fairness cream? Why are like the most celebrated actresses and superstars like so Anglo looking? Which is not to say that they're not attractive, but to say that why isn't there a larger range of presentation of different sorts of bodies and beauty standards all over the world, actually. So I think like also part of the journey was figuring out, and I think this is why you're having this conversation today, what is culturally very specific and historically very specific. And the best example that I can offer of this was that when I moved to Lebanon, so two things happened that were interesting. One was that that's a place, some of you may know this or not, where most of the domestic workers and construction workers are either from sub-Saharan Africa or from South Asia, mostly Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. But what was interesting was that I saw that most of my Arab colleagues, friends, they loved tanning. Like this was like the beauty standard, like to go out and get a tan. And at first I was like, this is so cool. Like nobody wants fairness cream. Everyone wants to be like this like bronze color. But then I realized that if I was walking around like sort of not dressed a particular way, I would get accosted in these really awful ways by like soldiers, police officers who would perceive me to be either a maid or a construction worker. And as soon as I would show my university ID, they would say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, professor." So this is a case where like the context in which, say, a tan is appreciated is so deeply tied to class. And I was lucky to have the privilege of being able to get out of those situations, but also for the first time, realizing what it was like to walk around in a body where you're constantly in danger in a way that was different. Like maybe this was the case like right after 9/11 in the US, but nowadays it's like, I mean, not to say that there's no racism that South Asians face, but I think it's a bit different, as in the first stereotypes that come to mind are of a nerdy professional community. Sometimes, again, this is variable depending on your gender, like other contexts, but I think that that experience in Lebanon also made me realize that, anti-blackness is at the heart of like these hierarchies in whether in the US, in South Asia, in Lebanon. The specificities will play out in different ways. And I think it's great that we're having this conversation to sort of talk through that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, it's kind of interesting because, um, you know, I mean, I have been to Lebanon and realized that actually that the fact that I was dark, but carrying capital with me, right? Financial and political and social capital with me changed the way people looked at me.
Yeah.
But I was lucky actually in some ways that I had a grandmother, Nani, my mom's mom, the same family that sort of, kind of thought I was an ugly child, who was very, very political and grew up in a world in Lahore where she learned a lot about lynching, actually. It was part of the newspaper archives, a newspaper she grew up with in the Americas. And so she actually taught me about the civil rights movement and taught me about like thinking about racialization in America before I came here. I mean, so I went to the UK before I came to the US, and really began kind of participating in Black politics there, because I was in the 70s. The world was very different. I mean, it was very much like it is now. There were people on the street, a lot of ferment. And I realized that as a person, you know, from a colonized country that was not white, that all of us were coded as Black. So I began like really working in the idea of Black politics. You know, when I was 14, actually, was when I went to the UK. And then when I came here, I knew, actually, it was very interesting. I had I mean, I kind of, my grandmother made me feel like actually understand something, because she'd seen a lot of violence and she was very politically active, that you really had to take a stand for other people, even if that stand cost you your life, right? A very different way of growing up that she had, because she participated in the independence movement, had a lot of people, you know, had people killed in front of her, and made the decision that she would not let that happen. So it was really, she asked me when I came to, as an undergrad, I was, you know, just a little bit in my, I was 17. She asked me to really understand what was going on the ground. So I really took the time to really see the politics of settler colonialism. I mean, I, you know, took it on myself to educate myself, the history of slavery, the history of what it meant for land to be seized by Native Americans. I mean, and I understood that the politics of racialization was about the value given to a body, right? Bodies that had no value, bodies that were became property, and bodies from which property was seized. So my engagement with, basically, if you would call it, Black Lives Matter, began in some ways in Europe, in the UK, when I was 14, and then continued. Certainly, I went back to India and then came back here when I was 17. So it's a long, you know, I've had a long history of working on the ground, you know, and then also dealing with what you're talking about, which is the ways in which South Asians really exempt themselves from color politics, right? And there's a long history of that in the US. Feel like it, that their self-representation allows them to be apart from it in a certain way. And I think, I mean, I noticed that you guys wanted to really talk about how to talk to your families about what's going on the ground. And I think that's what I noticed as a kid, actually. And you noticed some of that growing up, and, you know, continue to notice.
Yeah, and I think I'm struck now at my age at how easy it was to not notice certain things. So I guess I can say two things, both of which are like about, I guess, ways in which the endeavor of reading academic work has helped to process some of this. So and then coming into the conversation about media and representation that I think then Geeta can take up. So the first thing is that a dear friend of mine who's also from Houston, she just published a book called, I want to say it's called South Asian Migrations to Houston. I'll chat it to you in a second. But her name is Uzma Qureshi, and she's a historian. She frames her scholarship as an intervention in U.S. Southern history, so history of the U.S. South. And what she looks at is all of the immigrants who migrated during the Cold War, like around the 60s, from India and Pakistan to Houston. And she looks at how much of this was tied up with like Cold War politics and trying to woo over like scientists, engineers, etc. from these countries on the part of like US policy. And what her arguments are that pretty much everyone has this American dream narrative. Like, I came to the US with nothing. I worked my way up, and all of them chart a sort of success in moving out from the low-income, predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods around the University of Houston to getting out into the more affluent white suburbs. So there's like a very clear kind of, underlying assumptions of what success looks like. But more interestingly, what Uzma does is whenever she asked all her respondents, what did your parents do? What did your grandparents do back in Pakistan or India? Overwhelmingly, those who immigrated, and I would say this for my own family as well, had, quite some either caste or class privilege
Mm-hmm.
that tends to be forgotten in the I have nothing, if that's your starting point for the American dream. So this is also, I think, really important to consider in terms of like what it means to be part of a pretty affluent diasporic community.
Mm-hmm.
One, to say that that doesn't stand for everyone's experiences. Like we have, South Asians who have come from really much more difficult and less privileged backgrounds. And two, to think about what it means if we are part of like a much more privileged arena that I think can be forgotten. And then the second thing I was going to say was Richard Dyer's work. He's a film scholar. I think makes a lot of sense for this conversation and segueing into sort of media histories, where his work has in part been about the development of photography and film stock. So you think of this as like neutral, scientific, technological processes, but by going through old manuals and histories of these technologies, he basically shows that there was so much trouble taken to calibrate the entire system of film lighting and film stock to sort of around white fair skin, to where constantly this refrain is that showing Black skin in photographs or in cinema was a problem in every manual. Like it was listed as a technical problem, but what he shows is that wasn't something like automatic in the technology, but rather it was because at the early 1900s, the height of colonial empire and Darwinism in a certain way, that there were great pains to develop this technology around rendering whiteness beautiful on screen that continues to have an impact to this day. So excuses like, oh, we cast, light-skinned actors and actresses because they look more, they're more photogenic is not a natural thing. It's also about these histories.
No, absolutely. And I think that it's, in South Asia, literally the technology of skin, literally the somatics of skin, right? If you see, it's about makeup, it's about lighting, it's about a whole bunch of creams that were developed. Fair and Lovely is a classic example, right? Certainly in South Asia, almost all advertising fair people get fairer, right? You're not, it doesn't even, it codes in what we call verisimilitude, but it doesn't code in absolute, let's say, truth value in a certain way. It's a certain kind of truth value that allows you to understand that the only place to go is fair skin, right? So, and it's interesting to think about the aesthetics, the physical technology of the cinematic, that's at the heart of producing a kind of color value. So, there's lots of ways we can go about this. I think there's obviously, I don't know if Dr. Qureshi's book talks about like the, attempts by South Asians, which I think there's lots of writing on now, to actually recode themselves as white. And, one of the things, and it's important to understand, and I think this is what you're bringing up to go back to the section that you're talking about in reference to South Asians, that not to be white meant that you had to give up citizenship and rights to property, right? So, it's something I've come to understand in my own work, and sort of working with African American historians and Native American historians, that how much the property of whiteness, and if you look at the work on the idea of whiteness as property, that it's actually there's something at stake that people are terrified of giving up. There's a kind of we can I think of it as a melancholic history, right? That can be pulled up at any point. So it's not just that people come with a huge amount of capital and want to hold on to it. You want to hold on to it. You want to cling to it here precisely because there's a history that underlies it, that you're always terrified of. And the point is, you don't know that it is there, right? There's something, it sits deep in belonging, which is about giving up your rights to property in some ways. Does that make sense? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
So should we talk a little bit about Bollywood, and let's see how we're doing on time?
Yeah.
And then, because I think Dwyer's work is a great segue. And then maybe talk a little bit about like stuff we've done on the ground, or what it means to be an ally or somebody who works on race.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that one thing to note is everything that Dyer talks about while he looks at the Hollywood system was also about how, at the level of production, these Hollywood systems were kind of adapted everywhere. So like, for example, when he talks about how if you look at classic cinema from India, from Egypt, from Iran, from the US, from Latin America, this way in which you constantly see, very fair-skinned heroines that have this like beautiful, glamorous, angelic glow to them, but that privileges their fairness. That has been something that you see like in all of these industries, again, partly for the reasons of how the technology was developed in the West at the height of empire, basically. And it seems like the greatest, I think that I would never blame cinema itself for perpetuating this, because cinema is embedded in a social system at the same time as, there's a way it also is very, very powerful. And I'm not sure that those involved in the industry have also taken much pains to dismantle that system, which just means like on the ground, as Geeta was saying, like there is a lot of work to be done, I think, in South Asian communities. I'm curious, like some of you may have learned as children, especially those of you who speak Hindi or Urdu, like harmful little rhymes like Nani Teri Morni Ko Mor Leg, or like, songs like this, Baki, what is it? Baki Jo Bachata Kale Chor Le Gaye. Can anyone translate this? What does this mean?
Somebody want to speak up from the audience?
Geeta will.
I don't know what that one particular, like specifically that one means, but I know that recently there was a whole scandal type thing in Bollywood because they included like an offensive lyric about Beyonce being dark.
Beyonce Sharma.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's the most recent example, but
yeah.
I mean, stuff like this has been so heavily embedded in our cultures for so many years, and I'm not even gonna lie, like even when I go back home to Pakistan, you still hear these slight remarks or these references, you know what I mean? But I think it's all in combination with the stereotypes that we've had for so many years, but that's my little.
And I think that's a really good point, because it shows that the main danger is when these become so naturalized to where like you don't even think twice about it. Like clearly someone didn't even think twice when writing these lyrics. Oh, fair one, you're so beautiful that Beyonce would be ashamed even. Like you put Beyonce to shame is sort of the gist of those lyrics. Or, you know, this little harmless children's rhyme saying, oh grandmother, your peahen has been taken away by the peacocks, and whichever were left were taken away by a black thief.
Right.
So it's ascribing also notions of value to ideas of color. Like someone who is darker is poorer, has, you know, less morals, and that's part of the, you know, melodramatic structure of cinema. Even a film like Gully Boy, some of you may have heard about this, but the main hero, he was basically in like a kind of blackface, like his skin was darkened digitally to play like a lower class character. And the excuse that the producers gave was that he got a tan on vacation, so they did that to make it even for the rest of the film, which is, again, the problem with that is, one, the naturalization of somebody who is poorer is automatically dark-skinned, which is also wrong because, you know, like in every community there has always been a spectrum. Like it's not like if you're North Indian you're automatically light-skinned, or if you're rich you're automatically light-skinned, but yet somehow there are these values that have been assigned on this color spectrum.
Kale, so Mariam Khan is asking, does Kale Chor mean somebody who's in the dark of, stealing in the dark of the night? I think it actually means like somebody who is dark, right? Not just, and it's very specific. I mean, the irony of it is the Krishna in Hinduism is actually considered, he has midnight blue skin, right? His skin is so dark that it's the color of, you know, of midnight, and he wears a peacock feather. So it's literally, I mean, it's a play on, and he steals women's clothes. So it's a play on it, but I think you're talking, I mean, to me, it's important to think about the naturalization of value, right? So something that actually started somewhere else gets re-inscribed in a new codification of color value. And I think cinema, I mean, actually sediments that naturalization. It's not something that necessarily, it can sometimes produce it. I mean, but it definitely sediments it. It makes the naturalization feel so ordinary that there's actually pleasure in belonging to it.
Yeah.
You know?
And there's so many other examples of this, like Yashomati Maya say, and Krishna's asking his mom, it's like rewritten to say, is why is Radha fair and why am I black? Like that's a very kind of modern notion of a certain like shame for being darker skinned that's captured in that kind of lyric. So it's like building on an older repertoire of images, but that takes on like a new set of meanings in a more contemporary moment. Or even like lyrics, like some of you may know the film Padosan, where there's like a singing competition and the hero sings against the South Indian character, what is it? Like Jare Kaga, like you go away, you black crow. And this was also in the context of, you know, vehement sort of anti-South Indian sentiments in Bombay in that period. So yeah, so I think that like all of these historical specificities are also important to consider. And I think sometimes if, you know, we're too quick to like blame the media, then that can sort of sometimes make us forget about how we're also responsible in these systems as communities ourselves.
Yeah, I think, you know, I've been reading a book called Begin Again by Eddie Glaude, and it goes back to James Baldwin's work. And it's kind of interesting, so, you know, to think about how we do politics. I think one of the things that Baldwin, James Baldwin, who's, if you don't know, is an amazing African-American writer, poet, novelist, and queer. One of the things he talked about was really participating in the lie, right? And I think he said something really important, which is we all have and for him, guilt or shame were unproductive. I mean, I started doing work, workshops on racism in the 1990s with this group called Women Against Racism. And we actually began doing them after spending time with folk who were like Kimberly Crenshaw, who were really thinking about the question, the problem, rethinking how identification and identity and subjecthood work through the notion of intersections. And what was interesting is we realized very quickly, we were also reading Baldwin at the time, that it's really important to let go of shame or guilt and begin to take responsibility for our participation in the naturalization of something that becomes a form of value that then that's at the heart of institutionalized discrimination, and I think so. The question is, how do we do it, right?
I think it's time for the student panel. I can just, before we're ending, I can try to take one question and then maybe Geeta can also answer it. So I see a question. How is Blackness viewed in Hinduism? Is the caste system based on or address it? So I can say what I know. Geeta may know more actually and may be able to say a bit more. So one is that the one way of talking about caste has been the word varna, which does mean color, though in older texts, my understanding is that these were more symbolic colors. So in like Sanskrit texts, like the Natya Shastra, like a good woman would be blue on stage or green, or like, it wasn't literally always attached to color, at the same time as, most genetic evidence points to the fact that at one point there was a kind of Aryan invasion of the subcontinent by which, those who were indigenous and subjugated tended to be sort of, again, and this is like, you have to read, this is quite complex, but that Aboriginals had, darker skin, which is why sort of this value system emerged. And like when I was young, growing up in like an observant Hindu family, I used to wonder about this, like all these deities are praised for being dark skinned, like Krishna, for example. And then a mentor kind of pointed out, like, so some goddesses have 8 arms, but that doesn't mean if someone is born with 8 arms, you wouldn't be freaked out, or like, so that's also hard to say in terms of what is the one-to-one connection between, gods could be an exception in terms of like characteristics that are ascribed to them. So just to say that I think definitely there's a way in which hierarchies of color do intersect with hierarchies of class in ways that, again, like the instance of gully boys, like skin darkening, and the issue with that is the way that becomes erroneously naturalized, that there's a longer history that accounts for privileging whiteness even in sort of a pre-colonial context, but also that that gets exacerbated in certain ways, like after the kind of colonial encounter. I don't know, Geeta, you might be able to.
No, actually, I think I mean, if you actually look at the peoples, like Andaman Islanders look African, right? So you do have a very large palette of color. We had Greeks and Romans coming, right? So you have an incredibly large palette of color. I think that and we also had African rulers. We had African, I mean, we have a long and complicated history with Africa, trading with Africa, having African admirals and generals and rulers.
Yeah.
So my sense is, and if I go back, I mean, I go back to the Sanskrit and read the early stuff. And Varna, Varna means literally outside, right? It's literally, it's clothing. It doesn't have to be skin. My sense is that the sort of color politics that bring caste, class, rural, Aboriginal, I mean, literally, I'll say indigenous folk, because Samita and I are not indigenous to South Asia, right? I mean, and we might be mixed, but we're not really. I mean, and I really do think that one has to think that in a complicated way, right? That became more and more and more sort of entrenched as ordinary, as naturalized. So it's literally the ordinariness that I think is the issue. To establish value, right? So caste became associated with color politics, right? And I don't think I certainly, looking back at the 6th century, looking at the Ashokan edicts with my students, that was not the case at that point, right? The Natya Shastra, I mean, and certainly Sanskrit poetics, early, if you look at the Sangam literature, there's a range of aesthetic value. But I agree with you, in the contemporary time, gods and goddesses in Hinduism are given a break where people are not, right? They're allowed their darkness, whereas all of us live with the value that is produced through color. Like literally, color becomes the form through which value is coded.
I see another question, but maybe we can move on to like the other discussions.
Yeah, and we can actually address them later.
Yeah.
At the end.
Thank you all. And I look forward to learning from everyone else.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you for setting this up.
Thank you guys so much for being such amazing guest speakers. I was just sitting here and just taking it all in. Thank you guys so much. And of course, if you guys stay behind, all the viewers watching, they will be participating in our Q&A afterwards. On to the next thing we'll be doing. We'll be having a few students from VCU come together and answer a few questions. So we have Bilal Qureshi. He is a VCU political science alumni, and he's the current chaplain for the Muslim Student Association. Next is Azza Muhammad. She is a senior at VCU and diversity consultant of the Muslim Student Association. And the last guest is Zobia Nair, who is a senior at VCU and president of the Pakistani Student Association. I will open up the floor to all of you guys.
Thank you, Mariam. All right, so I'm going to be asking everyone questions, like my two guest speakers, and they'll just be answering the questions. If you have any questions, if any of the audience has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. All right. So this is for Bilal and Azza. How do you think one can be a responsible ally for the Black Lives Matter movement?
Should I go first or are you, Azza?
Bye. No, you go ahead.
Okay. First, I wanted to thank you guys for setting this up. So far, it's been a great event. So how do you think one could be a responsible ally of the Black Lives Matter movement? Something I've realized as someone who has faced racism myself and also faced colorism is that I feel a lot of the same pain that the Black community is feeling in regards to racism, but I also understand that it's definitely not the same, and it's not basically systematic and institutional how it is here in America for the Black community. And so something I've realized after speaking with other Black Lives Matter activists is that sometimes people who are very passionate about the movement, we have a problem of overstepping our boundaries. And this happens, but sometimes we should look at opportunities to support rather than making it about ourselves and thinking that, oh, we should be a leader in this movement. Rather, like the question asks, is that we should be allies. And what does it mean to be an ally? It means that we are there to support the movement, and we're not there to, you know, make it about ourselves, not try to make it like, you know, especially now in the age of social media, not something where it's like a spectacle for clout or something like that, or just, you know, any sort of attention that you can get. We're here to be allies for a movement that is, you know, addressing racism, addressing systematic racism, addressing police brutality. And we see so many examples of it now. And because of social media and the age of the internet we live in, it's not something that's hidden anymore. And so for me, being an ally means that I follow the lead of the people who have been in this movement for decades and decades. Because this isn't something from this year, this isn't something from last year, but it's been something going on before I was even born. We have people who've been fighting for rights for African Americans in this country for, you know, basically since the beginning of this country. It's only, if we look at the numbers, and I know it's sometimes hard to believe when you look, I've seen graphs sometimes saying, oh, when did slavery end? And it's very recent considering the founding of America. And so there's a lot that we have to learn from the people who've been on the ground for many decades. And that's something that I view as a best way to approach being an ally. Understand that this is an opportunity for us to learn, opportunity for us to help and support. And then, you know, and also it's a way of basically humbling ourselves as well, because although I have faced racism, I have faced colorism and all these different things that I've, you know, experienced growing up in America, it's not to the extent of the Black community, and definitely not something where I could say that there is something systematically oppressing us. It's rather, it's individual instances rather than, oh, there's so many different things in place to hinder the Black community here in America.
Elza, do you want to add on?
Yes. First of all, thank you guys for having me. This is a great event, very educational. And to answer the question, first, I'm a Black woman. So what I'm about to say is for people who are not Black, you know, people supporting the BLM movement. I would say that first and foremost, people should start with listening to Black people, like educating yourself about the Black Lives Movement, and make sure that you don't assume that Black people are the ones who are supposed to educate you. You know, you should do your own part on when it comes to being educated. That's number one. Number two, it's you can there's also other forms of allyship. You can I know protesting is something not everyone is comfortable with, especially looking at how protesters are being treated. You know, we've seen all that in social media, and how, especially here in Richmond, how protesters are taken into custody, and they're faced brutally. But there's other forms, like you realizing that you have a privilege compared to a Black person, even though and I'm gonna specifically talk about the South Asian community, because that's what the event is about. You as a South Asian community, even though you are a minority in a sense, but you do have privilege when compared to a Black person. Use that platform to raise awareness within your own community. We just, the previous speakers, they talked about how there's anti-Blackness in the community within itself. I would say host workshops talking about colorism. A lot of people are not well educated. They're not very comfortable with sociological terms like intersectionality, colorism, racism. Some people they're generally not aware that they are being racist, they are being prejudiced. So we should also make sure that these individuals are well educated, especially the older generation. I know that's it's very hard, because it's very hard to sometimes have a conversation with them, just because that's how they were brought up and that's how they were raised. The society they lived in, those are the principles that were embedded in them when they were young. So I would say also education is key.
So given that, how do you think that students can promote an accepting environment for Black students on college campuses?
Should I go first or Bilal?
Doesn't
Should
matter.
I go?
Go
Oh,
ahead.
okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would say honestly, making sure the environment is safe, like make sure you're not being microaggressive. Like a lot of people, as I'm gonna talk about my experience, a lot of things, little things people do, they don't realize that that's shutting off or turning off Black people. Like I don't know, using the N-word. Like a lot of people think that because you're a person, there's a distinction between being Black and a person of color. Just because you're a person of color, that doesn't make it okay for you to use the N-word. Or my making sure, like commenting on a person's natural hair, or comment like saying, oh, you're so pretty for an African, your nose is so straight for a Sudani, like your hair is so straight for so and so. Like comments like these are, and people are generally, again, I'm saying, like people generally think these are actually, like they're actually complimenting you, but they're not. So I would say being careful with your words, value your words, making sure that you are not hurting the other party and the other end with your words.
So as far as taking steps towards making an environment for Black students for different organizations on campuses, I think a lot of self-examination has to happen. That meaning you have to look at what kind of org are we, who are we as board members of our organization, what are our values as an org, and what are our personal values. And then we can also look at what, let's say, for example, if it's a cultural organization, it doesn't necessarily have to even be a South Asian, it doesn't have to be India or Pakistan. It could be an Arab or even the European one. But look at the within your culture. Look at what racism can you find within your cultures. Especially look at the previous generations, like from our parents' generations. And then we have to be able to be comfortable to attack these problems head on. And then we have to also not be afraid to call out some things that may seem to be cultural norms, but in fact they're inhumane. And you know, for a lot of places in the world, a lot of these cultural norms we see nowadays that may be considered racist, they're actually not even cultural norms of the people of that area. It's just something because of colonization or, you know, invasion of different other mentalities and things, where the mentality of people of a certain land has been adjusted because of these things. So because I have, you know, seeing racism now in South, let's say India, for example, where I'm from, you can see it very blatantly in the past 100 to 200 years or so. But then I read about, you know, old Indian history from over 500 years. It's like, well, these seem like completely different people. Like these people, you know, had good relations with people who migrated from Africa, from Central Asia, and different places. In fact, we had many people of royalty in India who are from African descent. So something obviously that which the whole different discussion in itself is, how did this all happen? How did we become, you know, how did this racist mentality come into our areas today? That's a whole, obviously, you know, you can have a whole lecture series on that. But I think, again, goes back to just self-examination, seeing where the cultural norms that we have that are racist, how can we basically push back against those and look at where we can personally fix ourselves and make ourselves foster an environment that's inviting to people, no matter what race, religion, or, you know, ethnicity they're from.
Thank you for that. And as you mentioned about microaggressions and experiencing those with other people, so going off of that, have either of you experienced or have witnessed someone promoting hate towards the Black community on campus or within your own household, like experiencing anti-Blackness? And if so, what did you like how did you react to those situations, and did someone else help you guys or like try to fix the situation? How did they do that?
I haven't witnessed so I'm talking about on campus. I haven't witnessed like legit like anti-blackness, like I hate you because you're black situation, but of course there were microaggressive situations like, oh, you're so pretty for a black person, or your nose is so straight. So I've faced a lot of those. These are some situations, and obviously the way I react is like, well, because I'm from Sudan, what I say, I'm from Sudan. Sudan is a very diverse country. There's no like a specific way for you to look. Like an African nose is not, you can't say this is an African nose. Like, you know what I mean? You're being stereotypical. So that's how I educate the person that, listen, you're not realizing this, and you think that you're complimenting me, but actually you're offending me and you're being prejudiced and racist. So what you did is called your microaggressions. So, and I explained the whole what microaggression is to the person, and educate them, because I know this is coming from a place that from miseducation. That's how I react. This is for an on-campus situation. At home, we have colorism. That's something very widespread, especially in the Sudanese community. So the lighter you are, the better. Like the more fair you are, the better, and the darker you are, the more like it's viewed as really being bad. It's really bad to an extent that we have this phenomenon in Sudan. It's like bleaching creams. So it's supposed to make your skin lighter. That's something very common in Sudan, unfortunately. Now, after the revolution, people are more educated, and they're realizing that they're understanding the idea of colorism. But before, it was really, really bad. In my household, again, I tried to educate my parents, especially the older generation. I tried to educate them, and I tried to tell them that like we live in a Eurocentric society. You're comparing yourself to Europeans. That's why you're viewing being white as being, the whiter you are, the better. The more fair you are, the better. No, we all, beauty comes from within. We're all beautiful in our own way. So you're saying that the more, also we have this thing about nose, like oh my God, they're so funny. The thing is that they look at your nose and they're like, oh my God, her nose is straight, she's so beautiful. So they use that as also beauty standards. So again, I make sure to educate them and tell them, listen, this is, again, you're comparing to Western, like this is a Westernized what is it called, idea of beauty. So just, I literally make sure to educate them. That's how I start. And thankfully, my parents have been more open. They've been more understanding. They understood that they're actually being racist. They're actually like, this is wrong. And it's a kind of a backwards way of thinking. So, yeah.
So I personally actually haven't witnessed racism on campus specifically from an event. Perhaps there have been events I've been and there have been microaggressions, but as far as promoting hate towards the African American community, I haven't. I think that's also just a benefit of when I was an undergrad, I went to VCU, and that stuff just wouldn't fly, of course, over there. You know, that luckily racism is stomped out very quickly there. But as far as anti-blackness in the household, I've seen it. I've also experienced it, and I personally experience colorism a lot in my family because I am in my immediate family, I'm the darkest person in the house. Outside of my immediate family, I am maybe one of 3 people who are dark skinned. Everyone else is very light skinned, and so my whole life I've always noticed colorism in the household. But outside of that, luckily I have my immediate family. Surprisingly enough, I don't see much prejudice and racism from my immediate family, but I do definitely see it from other family members. And I think that just might have to be with our upbringing, basically. When my parents moved to America from India, and when I was born, I grew up, in an area with lots of different minorities, Black, Hispanic, different Asians, and so I was able to get exposed to different cultures and different realities of people from all these different backgrounds. So I was able to understand at a pretty young age that basically the playing field isn't level for for different races here. And I was as someone who's a Muslim and I would go to the mosque, I would see how Black kids would be treated differently than South Asian kids or Arab kids. So it's something that I can even see in those different spaces. But within the household, colorism, I think, was probably the main thing that I witnessed, because it's one of those things where it's like, well, we're all from the same country here, but I'm getting treated different than my other cousins. And it's like something that you could, it was very obvious to see, and I've grown I have skin now, but growing up as a child, obviously things like that hurt, and I didn't really understand why. And maybe I can't remember if I ever felt this way, but maybe there was a point in time where I actually wished that I had a different skin color. I know, just because I wanted to avoid different things like that, of those examples of colorism. But luckily things have changed now. We live in a very, in a time where people can get education very easily. They can learn the experiences of others very easily. And now it's kind of on the people who are racist and who have, these racist tendencies. It's on them now at this point. It's not up to myself to educate them, because everything is out there for us to be educated. There's no excuses now for people to continue behavior like this, which is one of the benefits of living in the age that we're in, because lots of things are going to be exposed like they have been, and things will continue to be exposed. And from multiple different communities, I think we'll start seeing how racism is across the world, basically, not just here in America or in where we're from in South Asia.
I have one last final question just to wrap up, but you guys both mentioned about educating others. So what can we do to educate others? Like, what resources should they go to? Who should they go to? Things like that.
I would say, what is it called? First of all, I would say that schools have done a lousy job with educating people about Black history. Literally, the first time I was actually educated about like proper Black history is here at VCU when I took an AFAM class. That's the first time I actually the professor literally broke down history and how the African American history, like everything we were taught in school was westernized, it was whitewashed. So that's number one. So number two is, I would say documentaries, really good documentaries from Netflix, reading books, making sure the books are from Black authors. That's number one. I also have, so for anyone who's interested, I made this whole document. It's called this whole document that has all these resources about the Black Lives Matter movement and Black history. As I learn, I add to this document. So if anyone is interested in me sharing this document with them, just you can drop your email in the chat or something. I can share it with you. I have this whole document because people do ask me this question, where do I learn or where do I get the resources from? I personally cannot tell you there's a specific place you can get these resources from, but you can watch documentaries on Netflix. There's the 13th, the Malcolm X documentary. All of these are very, very informative. You can also read books. There's a book, if I can remember, I really cannot recall the name right now, but it is in that document that I have. These are all very informative, and they will literally break down Black history and what you need to know as a beginning for a person who's starting to get to know, or to a person who's a beginner when it comes to being educated about Black history and Black culture. I would say that. And yeah, I started my journey. I started learning because I used to live in UAE, and over there you literally live in a bubble, and you are not aware of what's going on around you. Literally, the first time I came to know about racism, about how Black people are treated, was when I came to America to study. So I started with watching 12 Years of Slavery. That's the first movie, and that movie is really good. It does not sugarcoat anything. It's just, there's a trigger warning. There's a lot of very graphic scenes, but it is a good movie describing and showing how severe slavery was, and it does not sugarcoat it. So I would also recommend watching that movie.
Thank you so much, Azza and Bilal, for such a great moderated Q&A session. Thank you guys for speaking. Our next speaker is actually Hirsch Parikh, who is a sophomore at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he is majoring in global health and health promotion equity with a minor in environmental studies. Hirsch is also the founder of Brown Activists, an organization which aims to spread awareness about current issues within the South Asian community. Hirsch, I will let you take the floor.
Sure. Thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking Lost Voices of South Asia, University of Virginia, and Virginia Commonwealth for giving me this wonderful opportunity to speak on this very important issue of addressing anti-Blackness in our community. So before I delve deeper into discussing how we can address it, I'll first begin by distinguishing between racism and racial prejudice. So I'm defining racism as being a power structure. It is systemic subordination of non-white groups in the United States, and it's a power dynamic that intentionally discriminates against a certain race, and in this case, the most impacted are Black Americans. Racial prejudice is a set of discriminatory beliefs based on assumptions deriving from perceptions about race and skin color. So underneath this framework, anti-Blackness in our community isn't exactly racism, but rather racial prejudice. And in order to tackle this issue, we all must understand that we as South Asian Americans benefit from this racist power structure and white supremacy. We also need to understand that that we hold a certain level of privilege, even though we are people of color, though it isn't white privilege exactly. So I'm also going to quickly go over what anti-Blackness looks like. So in our generation, we might not be outwardly anti-Black, but older generations possess these kind of beliefs. Examples include telling children not to date or marry Black people, and that is something that I used to hear all the time from my grandma, as well as possessing colorist attitudes like the view that dark skin is ugly. Examples in our generation include us saying the N-word, referring to Black neighborhoods as ghetto, and not calling out racism and microaggressions. Our complicity further perpetuates white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And while we might not be explicitly anti-Black, we still have certain biases. Some biases include being more alert or cautious when you're near a Black person in public. And one really good way to know whether or not you have these biases are taking the implicit association test from Harvard. I've taken it before, and it really set things into perspective for me. And once you take the test, don't feel bad if the results say that you have a certain bias, because virtually everyone has them. And rather than feeling guilty, take that time to self-reflect. Ask yourself where these biases come from. These biases are not inherent. You weren't born with these, but rather these ideas were taught, whether it be from television, school, family, your community, etc. So the second step to tackling anti-Blackness is first, obviously, understanding how we benefit from white supremacy, but also second, understanding where our biases come from and eliminating those. Also, being simply not anti-Black is the absolute bare minimum. We as Asian Americans need to be actively anti-racist. We have an obligation to be anti-racist. And well, the question now is, how can we do that? Before I begin addressing how we can tackle this and take action, just know that addressing anti-Blackness is unique and subjective to every individual. But there are a few key things that we can do to tackle this issue. The first step, like people said previously, is educating ourselves. Read up on systemic racism and oppression. While we do know that these two things exist and are ingrained in our society, reading research articles and papers on it really set things into perspective. One really good essay I recommend that all of you guys read is The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, which covers the criminal justice system in the United States. We also need to understand how Black liberation struggles are the reason why our families were able to immigrate here. Without their fight, we wouldn't be here today. Next, look at your friends in your friend group. Is it just South Asians or is it just white people? Are there any Black voices or perspectives that you have? If not, you should definitely get into thinking and asking yourself why you don't have a diverse friend group. We also need to prepare to talk about anti-Blackness and racism with our friends and family. And it will most definitely be uncomfortable, but this is something that is natural and necessary in order to address this issue. And like I said before, a lot of us stay silent when people say microaggressive remarks. But in order to take action, we need to start calling these out. We have to speak out about unacceptable actions. And like I said before, it will be hard and uncomfortable, but this is essential in combating anti-Blackness. And one thing that I learned in my counseling psychology class with Dr. Alyssa Ramirez-Stegui is calling in microaggressions. Calling in microaggressions is an opportunity to delve deeper and make meaning together as a community. It is a way to find a mutual sense of understanding and understanding other people's perspectives. This mechanism is focused on reflection rather than reaction. And reflection is the best way in order to understand our biases and is the best first step to take in addressing anti-Blackness in our community. So now I'm going to go over the explicit, direct actions that we can take to combat anti-Blackness. The first thing that I recommend is going to protests if you're able to. I understand that during this pandemic, it's harder for us to go outside and join a large group of people. But if you're on campus, for example, the protests will likely be smaller. So I encourage everyone to just go out and protest, obviously wear a mask, but it's a really good way to show that we stand in solidarity with the community. We also should be donating, especially to the groups that are serving intersectional identities, including Black trans lives and homeless Black lives. As South Asians, we also need to recognize where we're being performance activists. A lot of us stick to just posting things on social media and posting those Instagram infographics, but that simply isn't enough. Like I said, we have to be actively anti-racist. We need to be actively doing things, and we need to be showing our solidarity with the community. Also, like sign petitions and prepare to have conversations about race with your friends and family. And lastly, I encourage everyone to vote. The 2020 election is crucial for all people of color, especially Black lives. So please register to vote if you are of voting age. If you have any questions about how to register or how to request absentee ballot, I can definitely help you out. Again, thank you all for listening and taking the time to listen to me speak about addressing this issue in our community. And after this event, I asked that everybody take the implicit bias test from Harvard and reflect on your own biases in order to self-reflect and grow as an individual. And again, thank you guys so much for having me.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Hirsch, for that amazing discussion. And our last speaker will be Pahavni and Zaid from South Asians for Black Lives Matter. Pahavni is a first-generation Indian American, and she believes strongly in education accessibility being the forefront of social equity. She is committed to learning and growing in her understanding and practicing anti-racism. Zaid Sayed is an American a Indian Muslim American rooted in community and faith. In his spare time, he enjoys learning about resilient communities, intersectional solidarity movements, and Indo-Islamic history and art. I will open up the floor to them for them to address how to be an ally.
Hi everyone, my name is Bhavani, and I am actually going to be talking about the model minority myth, and Zaid will be talking about how to be an effective ally. And so I first want to start to say that we have to be really critical and intentional when we're having discussions surrounding race and making sure that we don't speak in a black and white binary. By doing this, we are erasing our own role in upholding white supremacy and our responsibility in utilizing our unique privilege in dismantling anti-blackness. To better understand our unique position and role, it might be helpful to think about racial triangulation, which is a concept that was developed by Claire Jean Kim. Racial triangulation shows how South Asians are privileged in their proximity and closeness to whiteness, although we're still considered foreign and not necessarily American. Internalizing those feelings of being perceived as foreign or other often pushes us to engage in different forms of assimilation to whiteness so that folks may better accept us. Society will interpret this assimilation as a way to place Asian folks in a racial hierarchy above Black folks. Society will also use any Asian success to cite deficiencies in Black communities, all the while continuing to other the Asian community at the same time. And so this ties into the model minority myth, which is predicated on anti-Blackness. The myth creates an image of the supposed perfect minority, which is decided by whiteness in the first place. And this image of the acceptable minority essentially allows for anything but being Black. It hails the Asian community and its successes while degrading the Black community and ignores the systems that uphold these conditions. It makes systemic racism and anti-Blackness a personal problem and one that supposedly can be overcome on an individual level. What ties into this as well is stereotype bias and stereotype promise. If you're Black, Latinx, Native, or a woman, your teachers and society and messaging are completely different than someone who's Asian. Often the messaging that you'll receive will be negative. And on the flip side, as an Asian individual, you receive messaging that you're smart. So this impacts not only societal perceptions, but also perceptions of yourself. And these biases work to uphold the myth. Essentially, the model minority myth grants the South Asian community a temporary stamp of whiteness that we can keep only if we're complicit in systems of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And it's really important to think about at what cost we are receiving this conditional whiteness and for what purpose. The myth generalizes our own community and ignores disparities within it. There's still a wage gap between Indian and Nepalese women. And in the workplace, South Asians are still among the least likely group to be promoted to executive roles. So it's really important that we're intentional in educating ourselves as well as others about this myth. Something that's important to remember is the history of Asian and South Asian immigration. The Immigration Act of 1965 only allowed Asian immigrants who the US deemed as being skilled professionals. And so our success in some ways was predetermined and predestined. It's critical that we take active steps to work against and do not remain complicit in perpetuating anti-Blackness through this myth, and understand how it's a tool used by white supremacy to pit communities of color against each other.
Thank you, Bhavani. So let's talk about solidarity and allyship. So I think Harsh and Bhavani both touched on the 1965 Immigration Act, and it's a really critical tool to understand how our identities as Black or South Asian intersect, and how so many of these struggles are shared by all of us to different levels. There's a really great resource by Anirvan Chatterjee that I'm going to put in the chat. And it's called The Secret History of Black Desi Solidarity. And that gives you a good look as to how our communities haven't always been siloed off into separate suburbs and areas. There's actually a really great history of South Asian activists and Black activists struggling together, building a form of cross-racial solidarity for our collective liberation. So I would bet that a lot of you, your parents, your families came to this country in the past maybe 30, 40 years, and perhaps maybe none before 1965. I'm talking about the Immigration Act that Bhavani also just talked about. So we really do have this sort of civil rights movement and Black activism to thank for why so many of us are here in the first place. But we can't think of this as some sort of transactional thing where you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. We engage in solidarity and this movement not because we owe debt or something like that. We engage in this because it's the right thing to do. So what does this sort of allyship look like? We hear about allyship and becoming an ally on Twitter and Instagram, but it's important to think of this not as allyship as a title that's bestowed upon you just because you show up to protest. Allyship is more like an action, a practice that you have to engage with repeatedly throughout your day. So what does allyship look like? If you are South Asian, I think Azza mentioned that you are probably a lot more privileged than most Black people. And that's just how the system works. So a quick way you can, for example, practice allyship in a non-performative way is considering what privilege you hold in certain spaces. For example, if you go to a masjid where the board invites police officers to the masjid to show some sort of false sense of unity, you can use your connections to the imam or the board of directors to help them understand why this may make Black Muslims feel uncomfortable. If you get invited to talks or events, make sure you check with the organizer to make sure that there are at least a few Black people also speaking at those events, so that you're using your privilege and whatever privileges you hold in society to make room for other Black organizers, leaders, or students or activists. If you have a lot of financial resources, you can donate your funds and energy to community organizations. We live in a time where there's a lot of civil unrest related to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the way the system has failed so many people in America. We're seeing not only in California but across the nation. California is where I'm based. A lot of Black organizers are being arrested for engaging in protests and stuff like that. You can help donate your funds, your time and energy to making sure that their bail funds are paid for, that their legal fees are covered. And that's a very real way to create impact. That's more than just sharing an Instagram story or something like that. On a more local level, you can also just try to educate your family, your communities on Black Desi solidarity, anti-Blackness, and make sure that this is a process of unlearning and learning. And you have to be open-minded and learn to accept criticism when you receive it without being sort of defensive and trying to play it off as, oh, I didn't mean it, it was unintentional. We're all here to just learn and unlearn. And it's totally okay to make mistakes, but just make sure that you're acknowledging it when you are. I think Azza also mentioned that you have to be intentional with your language when you're speaking to people. Don't speak for Black people. Don't attempt to take space away from Black activists, but make sure you are educating people in your communities about anti-Blackness and making sure that they're listening to the Black voices in your communities. And the last thing I want to share is this really great quote from Temmure Sundararajan from Equality Labs. And she says, we don't need an influencer movement. We need a listening and learning movement. You're not here to be the next MLK, Malcolm X, Angela Davis. You're here to help in the movement using the skills you have. So donate the time, the energy you have, your skill sets. Maybe you're great at social media or making websites or bringing people together. So use the skill sets you already have to help folks in the movement. You don't need to be on the front line speaking for Black people. Just use your skill sets that you already possess to help in the movement.
Thank you so much, Zaid and Pavni, I'm so sorry, for this amazing input that you guys have had. Finally, to conclude our event, we will be having a Q&A session. I know our professors have been here for very long as well. Thank you guys for all of our speakers for staying to the end. And we have a question and answer session happening. You can put it in the chat box, or you can go ahead and open up your mic and your video and go ahead and ask questions directed towards all of our speakers.
I have a question, sorry if anyone else is gonna go, but I know I was asking my panelists questions and Bilal told me that he had some resources to help everyone educate themselves on anti-Blackness, and so I wanted to give the floor to him real quick. Bilal, go ahead.
Give me 1 second because I wanted to show something specifically that I think is actually really relevant to this topic. So my friend Mustafa, he is a lecturer, and his next lecture is called Africans in Asia, The Forgotten Legacy. So this is the flyer for it. I don't know if you could see that at all. No, you cannot. Okay, so I'll just send a link for that in the chat. And so it's going to be basically covering the history of relationship between Africans and South Asians, specifically in the terms of royalty, because people want to know that there are lots of members of previous, the royalty of India who actually come from African lineage. So I think that'll be very beneficial. So I will send that now as soon as I can find it.
All right, thank you.
I just want to add to that, actually, the history of South Asians, my class. So one of the interesting things to add to Bilal, what Bilal was talking about is just if you actually go to read anything, I'll send a list of names to the organizers, but if you actually go back and read Indian Ocean histories, you'll actually find that South Asian communities on both coasts and in Central South Asia have been trading with Africa. Certainly the Ethiopian trading links are as old as before the 6th century BC, right? So Africans actually came to India. The standard narrative of Africans coming to India begins with the Siddhi community, which is much later. And there are many Siddhis still. I grew up in Bombay, spent a lot of time in Gujarat. There's Siddhi communities all over Bombay, Gujarat, all over the Deccan. But the history of Africans coming to India is way older than that. So it's kind of interesting to think about. I think, and I was also thinking a little bit about the history of working. I mean, I think, was it Zed, was it you, that actually talked about, Black South Asian resistance movements? I mean, W.E.B. Du Bois actually corresponded extensively with South Asians. He had somebody from Lahore come and talk in Black churches in the 1920s. So, and obviously continued into the civil rights movement. Almost everybody writing from the 1920s through the 1970s was involved with the non-aligned movement. So the organizing, the collective organizing, and this is why my grandmother knew about lynching and knew, actually, she taught me about the Black Power movement and Angela Davis in the 1960s and 70s, right, in Bombay. So there's a very, very long history of belonging together. So I think several speakers have talked about it, and I think it's important to remember that part of the sort of way in which South Asians are asked to become a model minority is to actually lose a history, to forget that history, to let go of that history. I mean, and I speak as somebody who's been shot at, crosses burnt on my lawn, had to pick up dead bodies, right? I mean, I'll say that I've been working on anti-racism workshops actively since the 1990s. And I think bias, we have more than bias. I mean, bias actually allows us to be complicit in structural racism. So I agree with our speakers that bias is important to address, but it's also important to just be willing to say, and I say it all the time to myself, I'm a South Asian. I am actually racist. I'm capable of being racist. I think many speakers have asked us to address it. And I think a willingness to just acknowledge what we are all the time without being scared of it is really important. I think, you talked about it, Hirsch, right? It's really, to just be willing to look at yourself and just address the fact that that complicity is constant, and it's okay. But the way to address it is to really take responsibility. So
Thank you so much, Ms. Patel. That was very well put. And just, I think that we forget that history of that trade that has taken place, and we've kind of come into this model minority myth, and we really led into that. So thank you for bringing that to a conclusion point. So if anybody else has any questions, please drop them in the chat. Please raise your hands. I think this would be the last time to address our speakers here. I know everyone is very tired at the moment. Thank you all for staying behind for such a long period of time. I appreciate every single one of you guys that spoke here today and attended the event. I know my team is extremely happy of having all of you guys here. So if we don't have any questions, I think this would be a good point to wrap up. We can wait like just about 30 seconds in case anybody wants to ask a question. Ms. Patel, I know somebody had asked a question earlier where they were saying, what is the connection between British colonialism and that history of, the having darker skin and just.
Well, the one thing I will say, and this goes back to Bilal's, I think it's, what you're saying, Bilal, is really important, right? I think one of the, and I'll go back to Samita. We have a long history of sort of really producing value through skin, right? But, I do work in the archives. I do, do deep historical work in the archives. And I think it's certainly one of the things that the British did, and I think that was really important, was produce the idea of criminal tribes and criminal peoples. And looking back at, it's really interesting. I was looking at the archives in around Tamil Nadu in the south, in Southeast India, and in the 1700s, and the ways in which workers were being spoken about, and some of those workers were actually eventually constituted as the equivalent of slaves, right? Many of them were reconstituted as what we call a pariah, which is was a nomenclature at the time for Dalit communities. The language used at the time was dark-skinned, right? The dark-skinned pariah. So I'm not sure we can hand the British everything, but I can, that a lot of the descriptive vocabulary that the British used actually naturalized, made it easier to accept a lineage of value through skin color, right? And like Bilal, I grew up, half Punjabi, right? So Bilal and I probably had the same issues around skin, and it really was a kind of naturalization, I think, of a kind of historical process.
And I can just quickly add to answer the question. It's also like in the same era as the colonial period with sort of industrial modernity, that structures of looking and vision take on a sort of unprecedented role in the way that with photography and imaging, suddenly there's the fetishization of complexion as something that structures your perception of people happens in that period historically alongside colonialism.
Yep, I agree. I think that just the way in which so the question is really, it's interesting when we think about colorism. Dealing with the stuff on race and racialization, I also get people to think about the really extensive history of racialization in the US. Think about voice, right? And I think, I agree with Samita that actually the way in which, the history of photography includes South Asia is central to the history of photography, right? And that focus on the visual as the marker of of identification rather than voice. In the US, it's voice as well. It's accent, it's voice. If you're from the South and you're in the North, you automatically get classed, and literally, you have to deal with certain kinds of discrimination around how you're constituted, what you get, right? But in South Asia, it's I think that the 19th century, the 1800s, was central to a kind of form of visualization that was part of a state apparatus. So it wasn't just like we're looking at pretty pictures. It was the way in which the state began to represent people was through the visual and through the photographic. Right, we have this massive photography archive from the late 1800s, for example, of the castes and tribes of India.
That was just very well put, Ms. Sanya and Ms. Patel. I think nobody could have said it better. If anybody were to want to reach out to you guys regarding a question, is there an email that we can put out there?
Sure, I'll ask for my Gmail because UVA email has been really iffy. So, and one of the things I do when I teach South Asia, because a lot of my work and how I learned about how to think about South Asia came from a Native historians, Native American historians, from African American historians working on what we call the culture of dissemblance, and from Latinx historians, right? So when I teach, one of the things that's really interesting, and it's something, I actually did this at Wellesley when I was teaching there. I got my South Asian students to help their South Asian faculty to redesign courses to bring materials from the US into courses. So, if you are taking a course in South Asia, there are things you can do. You can actually give this material to your faculty to think with, right? Don't assume we know anything. We don't. And I mean, I will say that I've on campus, the most egregious microaggressions I have seen and had to address were from faculty. Faculty to students, faculty to other faculty, and faculty to staff. So, as a student, you might see it and not know what to do. And, there are things you can do. There were a bunch of students that got together and talked to somebody in the department. So don't just look around. Don't just look at, your fellow students. Also realize that the faculty are inordinately and, there's a structure of privilege around being racist, right? And this is not anything to do with the South. The worst racists I've encountered on campus have all been white liberals from the North. So, just attend to that because it'll impinge on you. Psychically, it's very, if you're part of a classroom where this happens, you don't necessarily always realize it, but it actually begins to affect the texture of how you are, for the next generation in terms of, does somebody want to answer that? Because lots of next gen guys and girls and others and everything in between better examples. Go ahead.
I think that's a really good question. I think, like I said before, we have an obligation to being actively anti-racist because if it weren't for Black liberation, we wouldn't be here today. So I think since we are first, second generation South Asian Americans, we first need to reflect, like I said, on our biases and then not teach that to our next generation. Because I grew up with a lot of colorism on my side, on my family, a lot of anti-Blackness. And that's probably the reason why I had some implicit associations with Black communities. And then after self-reflecting, I learned a lot. And I think in order to prevent this from being passed down to the next generation, we really need to eliminate our bias first. And then we can stop that from moving on to the next generation.
Thank you so much for this amazing session. Hirsch, that was a very good point that you made. Thank you everyone for attending. I think this is where we will conclude this event. I am so excited to have had every single one of you guys speak at this event. I think that this will really leave a lasting impact, and this event will be posted online for future reference for many other South Asians to access when they're in a moment of, when they're struggling to find that clarity. So thank you all for attending this event. Thank you for all the speakers for speaking, sharing your stories, sharing the history. I think it was just so impactful. And that's her conclusion point. Thank you guys. Have a great day.
Thank you for
you.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you guys.